In this section of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about the role of labour in the economy. The rise of the factory system and then the evolution of the factory system to the type of large mass-scale production that we talked about in the last section of the lecture meant a very different employment relationship for workers compared to, say, 100 years previously. Management of production became more centralised and hierarchical, and, for example, work rules governing features of jobs such as starting, stopping, break times and what were introduced, as well as performance monitoring. What was driving this was basically a concern by employers to achieve greater coordination over work. So with expensive capital equipment in place, they wanted that capital equipment to be used as continuously as possible. And so being able to use it as continually as possible meant that workers had to be regulated to a higher degree than had been the case previously. Hence the introduction of things like work rules governing starting, stopping and break times. And of course, with firms becoming larger in order to utilise this new capital equipment at its efficient scale, it meant that firms were going to become more hierarchical in terms of the control over workers and their production activities. Another aspect of labour markets was that labour markets became more internal. By internal, what we mean is that firms were increasingly concerned about giving training to their own workers and thinking about, for example, with the new hierarchical structure of employment, if a vacancy came up at a particular level, thinking about promoting a worker who might have been at a lower level to that higher level rather than hiring into the firm from the outside labour market. So the idea of that workers within a firm might have skills or knowledge which was specific to the operation of production activities in a firm meant that firms were increasingly keen to keep workers who'd begun working for them and to use those workers sort of at higher level positions when vacancies became available. So the firm thought of its employees as a labour market within a broader, within a much broader external labour market. So what was the sort of explanation for the new employment relationship? Well, there's a couple of explanations that have been presented. One explanation is that this was sort of the playing out of class struggle between capitalists and the working class. So this argument has it that sort of a classic feature of the capital system is depriving workers of control over their work activity, and that the way that's achieved is through division of labour and through centralised control of production. What division of labour does, it's argued, is it creates a role for the capitalist. So workers are sort of can be required to do sort of particular production tasks, and then the capitalist, there's a role for them doing, for example, the management task. But by centralising production processes, you can then put the capitalist at the top of the tree in terms of the production process that's occurring. And the capitalist can then use that position to extract surplus value from the workers and accumulate further capital in a Marxist type process. The other approach to explaining this new employment relationship is as an efficient response to new mass production methods in the US. So a little bit like I've described in introducing these ideas about the employment relationship, this argument is that there was new types of capital that were going to be used to produce. The new type of capital required production on a larger scale, and it required production using the capital on a continuous basis to get the most value out of owning that capital equipment. And so if you were going to have a larger scale firm to be able to mass produce using this capital equipment, then you needed a new structure of firm, and as well you also needed rules to govern sort of the way workers were going to be using the machinery, to make sure that there really was continuous use of this new expensive capital machinery. Probably it's the case that most economists would think of the second explanation as being the main reason why this type of employment relationship evolved in the 19th and 20th century. There are a variety of implications of the new type of employment relationship which was occurring. One of them was the rise of trade unions. So in the late 19th and early 20th century, there was an increasing membership of industrial workers in trade unions. So in 1914, around about a fifth of workers in Britain and Germany had joined trade unions. In the United States, it was a bit below that at about 10%. But in other parts of the world, like Scandinavia, in fact, it was more than a fifth or 20%. And the rise of unions was in a large part sort of in response to the type of economy that was evolving with the rise of industry. The unions would go on to actually increase their memberships in a lot of countries like Britain, for example, and in the US, usually as government adopted legislation that was more favourable to their existence and to membership by workers. The other thing that happened is that often the working class, sometimes via trade unions, sought to have influence via political organisations. So, for example, in Australia, after the mass defeat of strike action by unions in the 1890s, the working class movement basically decided that if they were going to achieve change for workers, they needed to do it through the political system. And so they established Labor Party. And that Labor Party quickly became an important part of the Australian political scene, being one of the first parties to hold government when Australia was made a Commonwealth in 1901. And the influence of the Labor Party was then manifested, for example, in things like the adoption of restrictions against immigration, which was seen as something that was benefiting workers in Australia. So trade unions themselves, as I mentioned, sort of were concerned to address issues that were arising for workers in this new industrial economy. And two of those issues were unemployment and wage flexibility. So, for example, business cycle instability in sort of market-based capitalist economy meant that a major fear for workers was becoming unemployed. Governments weren't providing a social safety net of welfare payments at the time, so a lot of unions had the role of providing income assistance to members who became unemployed. Also, wage flexibility. So nowadays, we'd be very surprised if workers took sort of cuts in wages, but in the early 20th, 19th century, it was quite common for employers to respond to economic downturns by cutting workers' wages. That was something that the idea that you needed to do that, the fact that workers were bearing the brunt of economic downturns was also, I guess, promoted by the gold standard. So the gold standard was saying that, look, if there's external imbalance, sort of, you need to adjust by deflating the economy. And a lot of the brunt of that deflation would end up affecting workers through unemployment or having their wages cut to adjust to the deflation that was occurring in the economy. So initially, the issues that unions were involved a lot with were these key issues of unemployment and wage flexibility for workers. And as I've noted, the role and influence of unions would increase further as the government created a more favourable environment for their operation. achieving, for example, later in the 20th century, levels of well over 50% of membership of all workers in the economy in countries like Australia. Another major development that came out of this new employment relationship was personnel management, the rise of personnel management within these new firms. Personnel management was sort of seen on the labour side as a way potentially to achieve sort of social objectives and make the employment relation more responsive to workers' needs. On the employer side, seen sort of as a way to promote effort, discipline and productivity amongst workers. And personnel management became increasingly important within firms as a way of sort of trying to achieve these objectives during the 20th century. So by about the middle of the 20th century, there's about 60% of large US firms had separate personnel management divisions. Now, a couple of ways that personnel management sought to increase worker productivity. One way is through scientific management. So scientific management associated with Frederick Taylor was the idea that what you needed to do to increase worker productivity was do really precise sort of time and motion studies on workers, their activities, break the jobs they were doing up into a whole series of tasks, and then see how you might be able to get them to do those tasks better. So, for example, if there's some task that had to be done with some type of tool or piece of equipment, then you tried to work out what the optimal weight or optimal size or optimal type of tool was that would make the worker most productive in doing the activity that used that tool. Or you'd look at the productivity of workers doing different tasks, and you'd work out who was the most productive at one task, who was the most productive at another task, and you'd sort the workers so that they were in the tasks at which they were most productive. Another idea was the idea that you might pay workers what was called efficiency wages, or that you might use wages as a way of motivating employee effort. And so, nowadays a lot of attention paid to performance-based pay. For example, coming out of the global financial crisis, a lot of criticism of bonuses that are paid to financial executives. What we can see, as I'll talk a little bit more about this in this section of the lecture, is that the origins of sort of that idea of motivating performance through pay actually have a long history. And so what I'll do now is just talk a little bit about one example of scientific management and one example of efficiency wages. So the example of scientific management I want to talk about is a famous set of experiments called the Hawthorne experiment. So the Hawthorne experiments were conducted at the Hawthorne works of the AT&T Systems Western Electric Company in the 1920s and 1930s. This was a works that manufactured telephones and associated telephonic equipment such as switchboards. The experiment that ended up getting a huge amount of attention was done in a part of the works called the Relay Assembly Test Room experiment. So this is a picture of the Hawthorne works, an impression of what it was like. This is the Relay Assembly Test Room. The experiment in the Relay Assembly Test Room involved making a number of changes to the work conditions of the women in the assembly test room and studying the effect of that on their productivity. So there were things like introducing rest periods or longer rest periods, or introducing a shorter working day, or introducing extra compensation sort of based on performance levels. And the way the experiment was structured was that these changes to work arrangements, the employment relationship, were progressively sort of introduced. And what was observed was that productivity was increased sort of by a number of these changes that were introduced. But then what happened was that all of these changes that were introduced were removed. And you would have expected then that, well, look, all these changes have been kind of increasing productivity. People work better if they're given a shorter working day, or they work better if they're given a rest period. But in fact, what happened was that productivity improved again once all these changes to the work schedule were taken away. And that led to a major debate about which has been to some extent ongoing, about what was really happening in the relay test room. The interpretation that was most prominent at the time, due to a professor at Harvard Business School called Elton Mayo, was that what this showed is that informal social effects between workers were much more important in determining organisational productivity than any sort of formal arrangements you made, like the amount of work time or breaks or the type of pay that you were giving to workers. That it was all to do with sort of the environment that had developed between these workers being able to work in this small scale unit together rather than in the much larger factory, in the relationship that existed between them, the general sort of well-being and satisfaction they had from being in that environment. And so for a while that came to be quite an influential sort of approach to thinking about worker productivity. But I guess with some further analysis of the data from the experiments, that came to be sort of questioned a bit. Today, the experiments are probably regarded as telling us also that things like incentive pay had probably major effects on the productivity of the workers in the relay test room. Now, incentive pay effects is a nice transition into the final topic I wanted to talk about, which is the introduction of efficiency wages at the Ford Model T plant. So a big issue at Ford was high levels of worker dissatisfaction. So worker turnover was 370%. So that meant that every year, basically, you know, if at any point in time you wanted to have 100 workers working on the assembly line, it meant that you would basically be going through 370 workers to get 100 workers there at any point in time. So huge turnover, you know, obviously imposing huge hiring costs on the organisation, no chance to develop sort of organisation-specific skills. And the daily absenteeism rate was 10% in 1913. So Ford really wanted to do something that would create a more stable workforce. And what they hit on was the idea of introducing a new compensation policy, usually referred to as the $5 day. So the work day was reduced from 9 hours to 8 hours. The pay was increased from $2.34 to $5. That was for workers who were deemed to qualify, which was actually men over the age of 22 who'd been with the company for 6 months or more and who it was believed wouldn't debauch the additional money that they received. Now, the other thing that was introduced was increased monitoring of workers by supervisors to make sure that, look, if you're getting this higher wage, you've actually got to be working hard, and dismissal of workers who didn't meet the requirement of working hard. So basically, Ford's increasing a higher wage to try and, you know, much higher than the competitive alternatives outside, with the objective of getting more workers to stay with it. Of course, it's worried about people just coming along and collecting that wage without really putting in. So they also increase the monitoring and the extent to which workers who don't perform are going to be dismissed. And it seems like this has a large effect on Ford's profitability. One commentator suggests that labour turnover basically was reduced from sevenfold, from 370% to 54%. Absenteeism was cut by a factor of 4. And there were large decreases in the cost of production and increases in worker productivity. So, for example, some estimates suggesting that output production worker increases by 40 or 70%. So with sort of the new employment relationship, with workers being perhaps more anonymous in organisations than they had been before, firms had to think of ways to create morale, to create sort of long-lasting relationships with them. And the Ford approach of efficiency wages was one of those approaches that was tried. And as I mentioned, the idea of using compensation as a device for motivating, maintaining employees is obviously something that has been retained from that period through to the present. In the next section of the lecture, I'm going to be talking about the settler economies.